So thanks for those informative and I think just perfectly timed presentations. It was just enough to keep all the ideas, make them all present, and not dwell on them too long, so we can have a good conversation. I wanted to start out by asking each of you to talk about the relationship between sound as a physical material and then one that serves as a signifier in your work, because that process happens in varying degrees in your work and also within the range of pieces that you talked about. And it's a particularly interesting aspect of sound to me, but I'll save that part for later. So.
Good question.
Yeah.
Sure.
I'm not exactly sure. I think I tend to think of them maybe as one and the same, that sound just is what it is. It's the movement of air. It's our ears hearing that as pitch or other kind of timbre. So I'm not exactly sure what to say, except that I think it's when I try to think of them as the same thing that's kind of what's maybe most interesting to me. I don't know if I'm sort of sidestepping the question by that, saying that. Sorry.
Sure. So I guess I talked about it a little bit, but my interest in sound is really as it affects materials at a site. So the impulse or signal is less important to me than what happens within a space and what's received by the auditor within that space. And I'm not really interested in sound as it might, say, like represent some other space and placing it in another location. But more, it's the effects of this relatively simple signal generally on a space. So a bell, sort of useful in the bell piece is a very utilitarian tool used to create the piece within a specific context, which is where the work took place, not so much in what it sounded like.
Yes. And
well, I mean, I wonder if the association that we have with the objects that create the sound are more with the objects than with the sound thus created. Like when we were working on the Symphony for dot matrix printers, we obviously had the choice to take the sound of the dot matrix printers and do what any self-respecting electronic musician would do with such a sound source, namely to go into the studio and sample them and then work with the samples at will. So by keeping the actual objects, the bodies that produce this noise present and integral to the piece, what we wind up basically sampling, not the sound, but the entire environment. And in that sense, sort of the material and the signification, if you like, of these objects is sort of maintained together.
And to be slightly less facetious, I'm going to now say no. But to add to that we had this amazing, we witnessed this amazing interview with Panasonic, the sound group, and they were talking about their sort of attitude towards sound, and it was just great. I'm not really sure I'm going to be able to do the accent properly, but it's like, sound is like sushi. It is raw. No, sashimi. And I do think that that's actually relatively pertinent to the discussion, because I think that in all of the works that we do, the sound component is treated as very much as a physical experience and a perceptual experience. And my sort of training in phenomenology in architecture really made me want to focus on that kind of stuff. But at the same time, in the work that we did with the silo, for example, it's not actually terribly important, the experience of the sound per se, when you listen to the result, because it's always going to be terrible. It's always mediated by the internet, by the telephone, by this like loudspeaker compromise. It's never the actual experience of what it is to be inside the space, but it leads one to be able to imagine what the space must be like, because we have experienced similar spaces. So we're allowed to project our voice, if we like, or our sample, or our, Homer Simpson going do, into this tremendous space inside the silo, and test the space and imagine what it might be like. So yes and no.
A good answer. I think there'll be more yes and no's as we go along. But there's one in looking at the different versions of the dot matrix printer pieces. I saw one version of it many years ago in Berlin, and I remember it as being a very visceral, quite loud experience, really engaging on that. And part of the engagement that I had with it, and I think a lot of the people who experienced it, is the transformation of the objects, right? Part of the appeal is not simply the sound, but it's that they're coming from the subject, and you work very hard to make these sort of compositional arrangements with the objects. But that one of the essential qualities of it is really that sound of the printer, that in other contexts is more an annoyance than anything. I'm still, I don't know, but you guys, I'm still amazed. You go to an airport and they still print out stuff on dot matrix printers, and I realize it's an economic thing. It's not, has to do with utility. But that in your description of your presentation description of the quartet version of it involves a reference to sort of the workspace and the kind of an idea of perhaps the obsolescence of the human worker in the workspace. And those are two very different things. And this is kind of why I was asking this question, because that sound in that setting appears to have a significance that perhaps in the other settings, the dot matrix projects, that is a very different thing, that it doesn't exist. So I don't know, if that's an accurate reading of the piece?
I think it's a very accurate reading of the symphony series and the whole dot matrix set of works. But really, I mean, I think that the way that we work is we're very, very slow. Like we've been working for nearly 15 years and produced, I don't know, like 5 works total. I mean, there's been a bunch of minor works, but the way that we sort of approach these things is to take a starting point and then just completely obsess from that starting point and go outwards. So the initial gesture for the dot matrix printer projects was from this recording that I made of a binaural stereo recording of a typewriter. And I showed it to Emmanuel. Emmanuel says, "Oh yeah, I've always wanted to do this project, dot matrix printers. I want to put them on stage and hit print and see what it sounds like." So we did that, and it was horrible. It was absolutely awful. But we soon realized that there was this other possibility, that you have this transcription device, so therefore you can actually make a composition that will play back and always be the same. So you have this parallel between the orchestral structure or classical music structure, where you have a written piece of music and it's interpreted, and an instrument and a player and all of this stuff within this completely parallel universe of the office equipment. And then from there, it becomes an investigation about what the role of the worker is. Why are we subjected to these kinds of things? Why are we subjected to plastic forks? Why are we subjected to neon light? Why are we subjected to dot matrix printers? And the reason is all economic ones. That's what's possible to make now, and that's what's possible to sell to the consumer. So these things just become starting points for explorations of the sort of full potential.
Yeah, okay, that's good. And Zuriya, I wanted to ask you about some of the same things in response, particularly to the piece in the Oakland Plaza. And the reason I'm asking about that is that you're using bells, right? And bells in public spaces, of course, have a very long and complex social history. And it seemed like in that piece, you're using the ideas of the bell and the sound of the bell without attaching a specific inference to them, so that there's a kind of slippage, so that it's that in that context, when you hear the bell, it's an enaction and a kind of negation at the same time. Does that sound?
Yeah. All right, go from this side. Yes, so you're right, the bells is sort of a normal thing to hear in a downtown area, which is why they were chosen, because it's, not so upsetting to hear. But, once they go on for 5 minutes, maybe that's something a little bit different. And the signal of the bell, of course, is quite different for various auditors. Some people had this, thought of, the alarm when I was describing it, or, a call to service, or just the, kind of marker of the passage of time. And I wanted the possibility of all or none of these being what's conjured. So it's this familiar sound in a public square, but happening in a way that's maybe less familiar in this, which is, I think, achieved through the randomization. And it was also, I think, a piece that, importantly, there was no visual element either. And so there's nothing for someone to fix their gaze upon, and therefore also no real prescribed way of interacting with it or viewing it. And it could go unnoticed. And I think that became very important to the work, and to making a possibility for interactions between the various audiences at this space. There, as I said, there these art audiences who read about it happening and would come and sort of be the noticers in the space, and then people who are already using this public square for recreation or protest or whatever else was going on, who could be drawn in by the noticers or ignore it too, which was totally fine.
Yeah, there's an aspect of it which I don't know if you were thinking about when you were working on the piece, but which I thought of as you were describing it, which is that in part of the history of bells is that they used to serve as the delimiter for towns, right? That the acoustic horizon, the bell was in the middle of town because it would call people in, right? And that's not something that we really have very much anymore, certainly not in the middle of big cities like Oakland. And that was another case. I'm thinking about that. I don't know if that was part of your thinking when you were working on the piece, but in terms of how that square functions in Oakland, and particularly in the recent history with the Occupy movement, that there seemed to be a kind of reference to that the bell as a social marker and a physical marker and a spatial marker was very present.
For sure. The bells were, the locations were chosen because they radiated out from this square. And so, and they were also placed on buildings that were unremarkable, so not at City Hall, not at a church, and places where you might expect them. So as they created this sort of circle around the plaza, I wanted, again, to propose this plaza, which since Occupy has been a less comfortable place to be in a public group because it's more policed, as a center point and place to come together. And then once you're outside of that ring, you can hear the more individuated sounds of the bells, whereas inside you hear the kind of cacophony of sound.
Okay. And we'll open it up to questions in a bit, so start to prepare. And so I was also asking about this sort of duality, in part because your work, Tristan, comes out of a very strong musical background and musical composition. I know that there are plenty of people who work in sound that have a musical background that try and escape it one way or another, and they discover that there's a baggage that they can't quite get rid of. It's kind of stuck to them. I didn't get the sense in your description of it that was something you're trying to do, that you were looking at perhaps some of the properties of using sound in an expanded way, but without wanting to give up a lot of the things that naturally come with the sort of musical traditions that you studied.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think of myself actually as very traditional in sort of the media I choose and the way I approach them, whether it's ink on paper and drawing or composed music on sheet pages of sheets that musicians perform along with electronics. And even the electronics in those pieces, and those pieces are all through composed. There are no generative processes involved in the musical material themselves, even though algorithm is clearly a core part of the instrument of the microcontrollers that I'm using and the code behind them. It doesn't play any part in the writing of the music, even though I think about musical structures that will be represented well in simple information sort of structures. But yeah, I'm much more interested in finding ways to bring a certain kind of thinking, process-based kind of thinking, which is not even contemporary. I mean, I grew up listening to minimalism. I think those processes are the same that ones that I use. I'm more interested maybe in code and how, I mean, it's not a coincidence, I think, that minimalist music, the sort of simple structures that they were working with, are represented very, very beautifully and simply in code, like repetition, for instance. And so, yeah, in that sense, like, I think, in fact, I don't even try to, I try to stay away a lot from exotic instruments because I don't want to have any baggage of trying to step away from something. I think if in all of these pieces I'm trying to step away just a little tiny bit, and that might give me more of a platform to say something about these intersections or something, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's actually a good way to think of it. I was thinking about all your work in relation to the work of a couple of people, and particularly a few specific pieces. One was two of Jim Tenney's pieces. Jim Tenney's a Canadian composer, worked a lot with electronics, early electronics through the 60s, and then switched to mostly doing, I think, exclusive acoustic work after that. And the last of his electronic works was a piece called For and Rising from 1969. You guys are probably familiar with it. Yes. No? Okay. So it's a piece that is simply sine tones that sweep from sub-audio to above human hearing range. So one comes in, 12 seconds later another one comes in. So you hear it fading in and fading out. That's the complete structure. It goes on for about 12 minutes. And there's no, as you listen to it, it's hard to listen to because you're basically sounding like this continual sweep up. And there's no place to, it's a space that's purely sonic and has these very rigid definitions, but it has absolutely no place for the listener. You kind of are experience this thing, but it's like, no traction. Like when they tell kids about, resistance and traction and gravity, it's like you get rid of traction and you can't move. So it's that idea. And then, so that's a form of negation that's all about sound and all about some aspect of electronic and sort of musical sound. And then a few years later, he made a piece called Critical Band, which was for acoustic instruments and all focused the sound on a very narrow frequency range so that you would hear a lot of overtones, and that this was, it was a way of thinking about listening to acoustic sounds, acoustic musical sounds, in a particular way that you would focus only on basically the sensory aspects of it. And it seemed, and in a lot of the work that you've done with the various instruments and the composition, it seems like you're using some of those same ideas, or there's some reference there, so that you're listening to a particular kind of space that you can't get simply with the acoustic instruments or with the electronic ones, but it's this space in between that the interest happens.
Yeah, sure. Those pieces sound great. I've been sort of waiting for the right time of my life to really dive into his music, so maybe now's the time. Yeah, no, totally. I think that my music has gotten more austere, more focused over time, but then weirdly branches out maybe in fighting, trying to fight that. But on the topic of range, working with one-bit sound the way I do, where all of the sound signals are fixed amplitude, so the ones are always a certain voltage and the zeros are always the reference to that, that higher frequency sound, like if you have 2 octaves of pitch, for instance, the one above is oscillating twice as often, it's moving twice as much air, it's also higher frequency, we perceive it as louder, and since I don't change the volume of the electronics, and I need to pair them with acoustic sound, it kind of boxes me into these narrow ranges automatically. Something that I finally broke away from in a way with that big piano piece with 40 speakers surrounding the piano, because I could use multitude of fixed amplitude sources in order to, and they all settle on this one low tone, and it sounds really meaty and kind of great. It's something I wasn't able to do for those sort of technical, scientific reasons. That was kind of a tangent off of what you said.
I guess I was also thinking in terms of the one Tenny piece, the electronic piece, that moving back and forth in front of that wall is kind of like the enacting, because you can hear the sound as you move. Sure. And that was the first thing I thought was like, oh yeah, now here's that space in that other piece that doesn't exist. Like it's made it happen. I guess.
Grounding.
Yeah. Grounding. And Surya, I was going to ask you about, since you don't really talk about the piece here, I don't know how much you want to say or whether you want us just to go in and experience it, but to me it had some of those same properties, that it was all about moving through the space, placing yourself in it, listening carefully, and then especially sort of listening carefully in relation to the objects that are in the space.
So I guess I could talk a little bit about the work, which was commissioned by the gallery and made for this space. So I think it would work in another white gallery space. And as you say, it is about the situation of the auditor as she moves through the space, rather than I guess the sound that's coming through the speakers that I'm using, which is monolithic, but as it's perceived in the space, is anything but, hopefully. And what my interest in this space, and when I got to the gallery, is I wanted to create some sort of architecture within the space that wouldn't use walls, or create an image of the space for the viewer that wouldn't be dependent on what exists there within this kind of rectilinear building, and to have a space that sort of like changes in space and time and is influenced not only by the viewer's own body in the space, but by the presence of other bodies. So even if you're still and someone else is moving, you can sort of hear them moving through that space. So the vessels in the space were sort of also meant to reference the body of the viewer, which is why they're included, but similar to the speakers, which are all producing the same sine tone, they are tuned to the same pitch if they were to be played. But the vessels, again, they are containers and receivers, and I think also perhaps feminine in their form, and reflect an exaggerated form of the female body, and are certainly anti-phallic in that they do contain. So they're meant to be sort of surrogate bodies in this space, and the work is maybe meant to be in contrast to the kind of rectilinear Philip Johnson building, and propose something that's slightly different.
Yeah. Those of us who spend a lot of time in this building really appreciate that. I want to open it up to questions. So if anyone has. Yeah.
I'm just curious how all of you see feeling in terms of the installation versus the sound work, and considering the uses of various technologies, how you
say quickly. I think I don't know so much about my work is not site specific per se, although the room that it's in, of course, is quite important to the experience. But I like diversity of space. The piece that's here, the 1,500 speakers, 25-foot wall. Maybe the one thing I could say about it is that they're all ranged on a flat plane, specifically because there is, like, to make it so that there is no specific optimal viewing, listening location. Like they could be, for instance, in a hyperbolic arrangement or something, so that there would be one point in the space that's the ideal listening point where you can hear them all at the same volume. But because they're in a plane, in order to hear them all at the same volume, you'd have to be infinitely far away, so that your kind of distance approaches the same for each speaker. In terms of like longevity of pieces, that's kind of open for me at least, but I do like the fact that technology is part of the real world and that it rusts, its kind of materials fall apart and stuff. And my feeling towards I don't like the idea of a document standing in for the actual piece, but I do like the document kind of referencing the piece. They're not one and the same. One of the worst things I ever saw, I thought, this might just be me, is a Namjoon Paik retrospective. Maybe all of the exhibitions of his work are like this now, but all the TV pieces had like LCD screens inside them in the old TV enclosures, and like not even really convincingly done. So the color space is all wrong. It was a kind of a disaster. So that's what I don't want to be doing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I feel similarly about documentation as you, and really impressed by artists like Maria Nordum, who doesn't allow documentation, or it's something that's totally different from the work, and kind of its own piece. And then as far as longevity, the glass vessels will probably survive, or you can keep going to the thrift store in 100 years, hopefully, and find similar things.
Hopefully there's glass around.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I think the apocalypse is probably coming before that, so that's right. But no, but yeah, and the speakers. I mean, this is a piece that I think would be very difficult to document in a way that would, really represent the experience. So I think the documentation has to become its own piece.
Although our works are usually not site-specific, they're always very much technology-specific, and I think that I'm okay with the fact that eventually these things will break. They're surprisingly robust. Quite a few of the technologies we work with are still going strong, much far after their projected expiry date, but they're not going to last for 200 years, and I think that's okay, because really what we're doing is intervening in the present historical moment in terms of our relationship with technology, right? Like when we made the printer piece, we were addressing it to a public that remembered the sounds of dot matrix printers, and we were like, we're rejigging the meaning of a known phenomenon. Well, you play this piece now, I mean, people of a younger generation have no idea what these things even sounded like, unless they really pay attention at airports, because that's the one place where you still will find them, for the moment anyway. So from the moment that like that original reference to a technology is lost, the purpose of the work is no longer fully served. As for documentation, I mean, when we do document the work, we do our utmost to turn it into a piece in its own right. So there's a standalone audio release, like a CD vinyl release of a couple of the pieces, and those will continue to exist, but they're another thing again from the installations.
I just wanted to add to that just one thing that we think about these things as being apart, these technologies as being apart from the rest of the history of art. And I'm sort of very much against that position, because if you look at the history of painting, you have this moment in painting where somebody invents a new way of making blue. A new blue suddenly becomes available on the market because somebody's like importing like beetle shells from here to there, and all of a sudden blue becomes trendy, and all of these artists adopt it. And then from this moment on, we have this color through basically technical innovation available to the artist. So I see very much the adoption of the latest technology being part and parcel of the process of making contemporary art, whenever contemporary happens to be. It's just that now we've got to this position where things are being invented at such a rapid rate and disappearing at such a rapid rate that people born within the space of 10 years may or may not have been exposed to these kinds of technologies, like Emmanuel was saying about the dot matrix printers. But I think that actual that fact is a very important thing to actually be engaging with as an artist. So yes, this stuff is going to be obsolete, but that's why we're doing it, because obsolescence has become so important to our society.
And we have time for one more question. Sorry.
I really have a lot of questions, but one's kind of really bugging me, and that is, do you each have like a physicist on speed dial, or do you sort of fancy yourself as sound scientists?
I do not fancy myself as a sound scientist, but I have lots of friends who are engineers, and that's really helpful, I think. There's been a number of projects that have worked so well in my head, and then when I thought of describe them and taking them to the physical world, realized that it was against the laws of physics. So it's helpful to have people to run things by or test things out with.
For me, it was like I just read as much as I can about physics, in particular, quantum mechanics and everything. And I think that thinking about that stuff has led to a lot of this stuff, and also in particular early computer science work, like Kurt Gödel and Alan Turing and stuff like that, was really, really meaningful to me. I'd actually love to have a sort of scientist on speed dial. I had the pleasure of meeting Seth Lloyd last year. He was a quantum computation expert at MIT, and I really hope to talk to him more about this kind of stuff.
We actually have several on speed dial.
Hell.
Yeah, from basically from the get-go, when we first started working together, we knew immediately that we needed outside help. But that was really because, I think that we view the practice that we have as a collective effort. We regard ourselves as being artistic directors of a larger team. The first guy that we met is he designed the lottery network for Jamaica and the satellite telephone communication system for sub-Saharan Africa. And he's like, yeah, sure, I think I can help you. That's great. And computer programmers and mathematicians and basically anybody that we can get our hands on who's able to inform these processes to try and translate from where our starting point to where we want to go. And I think that's really amazing. That's really fascinating, is allowing us to engage with the technological process where it actually happens before it gets into consumer hands is really quite a privilege.
Well, thanks to all the artists for providing such wonderful work for us and for sharing your thoughts and ideas. We'll head outside where we can continue the conversation, and I would also encourage you guys to all come back sometime when it's not a reception so you can really hear the works in precise detail. So thanks.
Thank you.